there were certain groups that came about, and there were certain issues, right? And these issues by which these sects came about, by which these misinterpretations happened, are still the same ones today. So I would say the 2 or 3 main issues that happened immediately after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, or within 20 to 30 years of his death, were the issue of succession. In other words, who's going to be the Imam, who is going to be the Khalifa of the Prophet ﷺ, who is the one who's going to have the leadership. This is where there was a lot of khilaf, a lot of difference of opinion between the ulama, or between the people surrounding the Prophet ﷺ. And then the issue of interpreting the Quran and the Hadith. To what degree do we take things literally? Do we take things figuratively? What methodology do we apply to understand these things? These are the 2 main issues, right? And I would add a third one, if possible, the nature of divinity, the nature of God, His attributes. Are they real? Are they figurative? You know, how to read certain verses in the Quran. So all of the groups that came after, even the groups today, I can say with fairly good amount of confidence that it goes back to one of these 3 issues. This is where the khilaf is. So there appeared a group after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the khilafah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the khilafah of Umar, then the khilafah of Uthman is when the issues began to arise. After the assassination of Uthman, and I don't want to go into so much about the, kind of the context of how that happened. There were certain appointees that he appointed that were from his tribe that people took issue with, and the problem grew until there was a group that thought it was fair to assassinate this companion, the husband of 2 of the daughters of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So again, that went back to political succession. They thought that, in their interpretation, this was justified because they had another issue of imama, and they thought that he didn't have a right to that imama because of their perceived or the perceived mistakes on his part from their part, right? And none of the people who took part in that were people who understand, were people who had relationship directly with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. One thing that you will notice is that all of these groups that came about, they all were not companions initially. Not the Shia, not the Khawarij, not the Mu'tazila, obviously, which was a theological group that came later. All of these groups didn't have sort of direct connection to the Prophet ﷺ. So when the Prophet ﷺ said, يَحْمِلُ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ مِنْ كُلِّ خَلَفٍ عُدُولُهُ مِنْ كُلِّ خَلَفٍ, right, from each generation. So if there's a skip, right, and you're left with the text by yourself, and you're left with your own ego, and you're left with a political agenda that you want to achieve, this is where the problems can arise. So after the death of Uthman, radiallahu anhu, and buya lil khilafah Sayyidina Ali assumed the khilafah, then there arose an issue, a khilaf, right? Is it more important to designate the new imam, the new khalifa, or is it more important to find the assassins of Uthman? And this is where the khilaf became between Sayyidina Ali and Muawiyah, right? And we say, radiyallahu anhum ajma'een, right? We say, may Allah be pleased with them both, because they were both companions. And we say in this particular khilaf, right, it was amru ijtihadi. It was a matter of ijtihad, in finding what would be the best thing for the ummah at the time. And the majority of Ahlul Sunnah, we all say, al-haq ma Sayyidina Ali. We believe Sayyidina Ali was in the right. We believe Muawiyah made a mistake. But that mistake does not remove him from the fold of Islam. So you never found, right, you don't find in any of the literature that either Sayyidina Ali or Sayyidina Muawiyah, they made takfir or made a statement to the effect that this other person is no longer in Islam. None of them made those statements. Who made those statements later on? People who were not from those groups, right? There was a group apart who were with Sayyidina Ali, right, who later left him, right, who seceded, who later became known as Al-Khawarij, right? And the Khawarij, right, they not just represent a group, they represent a mindset. They represent a way of thinking. One of the things that they did, right, Sayyidina Ali would be on the minbar giving the khutbah, and he'd be speaking, right? This is the companion of the Prophet ﷺ. This is his cousin. This is the wife of his daughter. This is the father of the Prophet's grandson ﷺ. Imagine that, he's in front of you. Yet these are these people in the audience who are saying, and interrupting him, saying, "In al-hukmu illa lillah, in al-hukmu illa lillah, in al-hukmu illa lillah." They're bringing a nas, right? They're bringing an ayah from the Quran, right? That the hukum, The command is not for anyone except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because they felt Sayyidina Ali compromised, رَضِيَ بِالتَّحْكِيمِ. What does that mean? He compromised and he said, let's have a third party, let's have arbitration in modern context between myself and between Sayyidina Muawiyah, so we avert the spillage of blood. They thought that was an act of kufr. They thought that was an act of kufr. Not a single one of them was a companion, right? They were all outside of that. But yet it was their own ego, their own nufus, in our interpretation, that led them to have this interpretation of whom? Someone who knows the deen better than all of them put together, right? But nevertheless, they seceded and they became this separate, distinct group, right? And so the khilaf became over first the tahkim, right? A political issue, should he have agreed to that or not? And then later over succession. And then it morphed into a theological division. Why a theological division? Because one of the things that extremists do, or al-ghalin, is that in order to justify killing, persecution, destruction of others, you have to justify in a theological sense, if you're a religious person, or you're trying to be a religious person. So what did they need to do in order to justify it? Somehow their adversaries had to be outside of Islam. They had to be no longer Muslim. So the Khawarij had a miscued interpretation of the verses. So they said that Sahib al-Kabira kafir. They said a person who commits a major sin is outside of Islam. Right? Someone drinks, someone fornicates, someone does anything like this, that's an act of kufr because they disobeyed God. And then they took a step further. They said, well, by that logic, any sin is a major sin, because why would you disobey God to begin with, unless you're a kafir? So they said every minor sin is a major sin, and every major sin is an act of kufr. Hence, anyone who commits minor sins is a kafir. See how the theology developed? Which is no different than many of, I would say, the methodology of many of the modern day extremists. Not all of them, but many of them adopt a similar type of methodology. So you need to anathemize, you need to otherize the other in order to make them your adversary, in order to make the spillage of their blood something that's permissible in your eyes. So they already had the narrative, they already had the agenda they wanted to pursue, and then they adopted the appropriate theology to support that particular agenda, right? But the people of haqq, the people of truth, the people of the sunnah, do the opposite. You look at your methodology, you apply it, and then see the result after that. Not that you have a predetermined result and you try to justify it via that particular way. So that's one of the hallmarks of extremism that happened in their particular time. Now, of course, the difference back then is, we're talking about companions here, right? We're talking about people who were udul, right? People who were upholding the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Khawarij were dealt with, right? They were dealt with in two ways. Ali radiallahu anhu, he sent his cousin Ibn Abbas, and he spoke to the Khawarij about the theological issues that they had issue with. And much of it was related to the interpretation of certain words in the Quran, which they didn't understand. So a couple of thousand of them returned with Ibn Abbas and left the Kharijite army. The rest stayed, and they were fought and they were killed in battle against the army of Sayyidina Ali. But of course, that was not the end of them, right? Because you can't just defeat a way of thinking, a mindset. Because if the same conditions are repeated, that same mindset will return. So throughout our history, there has always been this type of Kharijite or Khariji type of thinking that is extremist because it's trying to pander to a particular political agenda.